How's it going, everybody? It's Combat and today I'll be talking about my Modern Horizons draft deck. So this was my first and probably only draft of Modern Horizons, as I don't tend to play the more expensive, like, Masters style sets very much, just because the price is pretty high, and also, unfortunately, Modern Horizons is not coming to Arena. But for my first and only draft, I think I did pretty well. I ended up going 3-0, actually 6-0 in the games. That's kind of crazy to me. I don't think that this deck is that good, but I do think that it's pretty strong, definitely with some very, very nice bombs to hopefully steal some games. And they certainly did. So I drafted kind of green blue snow. A lot of my snow stuff is snow creatures. I didn't actually manage to get that many snowlands. I do have the one snow covered forest, one snow covered island, and two frostwalk bastions. So the biggest thing that I would say about this deck that could improve it is a few more snow covered forests or islands. If I had managed to pick any more of those up in the draft, that would have been really nice. But other than that, there's a lot of fun stuff. The deck's a little bit slow, but it has a very, very strong late game. And just a lot of pretty beefy mid-range creatures like the Frostwalla here being able to be a 4/4 that you set out on turn 3. So let's just go through the mana costs here. First we have Spore Frog, which actually ended up being better than I thought. There were games that I drew Spore Frog by itself, and I was happy with it. Just poking in for 1 damage a couple times in the early game and then being able to sack it later. But this card is in here for a card that we'll talk about later. But the other 1-drop I have is Crashing Footfalls. I actually never got to resolve this card. So I'm not entirely sure how I feel about it. I think that this can be a very bad top deck late game, simply because there's no alternate way to cast it. You have to suspend it. So if you draw this late game, it's like turn 9 or 10, and you really need to impact the board, this is a horrible draw because it doesn't do anything for 4 turns. But the potential upside is so high of being able to suspend this on turn 1 and just have 2 4/4 tramplers out on turn 5, in addition to whatever else you're doing on that turn, is just really nice in theory, but again, literally never got to resolve the card, so not entirely sure about that one. Next up, we have Mother Bear. This card is insane. The set definitely has a lot of very, very powerful commons for limited. This is a 2-mana 2/2 for 2, which would be great in pretty much any limited format. That's a fine card. But also, for 5 mana, you can exile Mother Bear from your graveyard to create 2 2/2 Green Bear creature tokens. You can only do that when you could cast a sorcery. So this is a lot like, there was an old zombie card in Avacyn Restored or something like that, I believe. That was a 2-mana 2/2 zombie, and for 4 you could exile it from your grave to get another 2/2. This is just so much better. 1 more mana and you get 2 more 2/2s. It's 3 2/2s off this one card. I think this is just a great card. It gets out there early, trades off, and then late game, you basically just have a flashback spell in your grave. So very good card. Huge fan of Mother Bear. We also have Treetop Ambusher, 2 mana for a 2/1, dashes for the same mana cost, and whenever it attacks, target creature you control gets +1/+1 until end of turn. Not as happy with this card, but that's a lot just because my deck isn't super aggressive. My deck is a lot more about larger, beefy creatures. I think definitely with a quite low-to-the-ground deck, this card could be quite good, but overall, it just did a lot of early game trading. I needed whatever kind of early creatures I could get just to survive to the late game, because a lot of my opponents were playing some pretty fast decks. Next up, we have 2 Winding Ways. This card is fantastic. It's a mulch, but you can also choose creatures if you want. I usually ended up having to choose lands with this. And it's also in here because it's a really, really good combo if you have any kind of graveyard shenanigan type stuff. I do have Genesis, which cares about cards in the graveyard, and Webweaver Changeling cares about cards in the graveyard. So that was a big reason that I wanted to run these 2 Winding Ways, and I found myself liking the card enough that I'd probably run it without a whole lot of graveyard synergy. You do want a little bit, though, at least. Then we have a Talisman of Curiosity, which is obviously great. Any kind of ramp you can get in Limited can get you to your large stuff quicker. And that is really what this deck wants. Again, just a lot of relatively beefy, high mana cost creatures in here. And a Winter's Rest. This is a narcolepsy, but it only works if you control another snow permanent, so certainly not the strongest piece of removal, but it did come in quite handy, just because I didn't have that much removal at all in the first place. So yeah, it taps the enchanted creature, and as long as you control another snow permanent, it does not untap. So you do need another snow permanent. That usually actually ended up just being like a Frostwall or something like that. But ideally, you just randomly have a snow land out, and that will make that card active. On to 3 mana cards, we got 2 Frostwall. I have mentioned it a decent amount by now. Just a 3 mana 2/2 that if you get any snow mana, is basically a 4/4 at the cost of 1 mana per turn. So very nice, very aggressive, pretty big for its mana cost. Then we have Mana War, the classic. Everybody loves Mana War Unlimited, just a great card. It can slow your opponent down if you need some time to breathe, and it's also really good on the offensive because it can get rid of a blocker and force them to recast it as well. Then we have 2 Crows and Tusker. I absolutely love this card. Fantastic in Limited. Super good late game, super good early game. It's whatever you need it to be. If you get it early game, you get to cycle it, grab the land that you need, and draw another card. And if you get it late game, it's obviously a 7 mana 6/5, which is just some good beef. So Crows and Tusker, fantastic card. Was happy to pick up a couple of those. Same with Exclude, another fantastic card. 3 mana, counter a creature spell, and draw a card. Kind of similar. Like, if you get this early game, you're happy countering the first creature that they play. Like, you could just save your 3 up and be like, I'm just going to counter the first thing I see just to draw my card, get this out of the way. But also, if you get this late game, you're like, alright, I'm ready for some kind of bomb creature if it's coming out. Just a very good card. Huge swing in card advantage because you're up a card, they're down a card. Very good stuff. Then we have Abominable Treefolk. This is kind of the biggest reason that I wanted to try to draft a lot of snow cards. Didn't end up with a lot of the snow lands, but a decent enough amount of the snow creatures that this guy was usually a 3/3 or a 4/4. It is the Abominable Treefolk. 2 green and a blue for an XX, where X is the number of snow permanents you control. It also has Trample, and its ability is really strong even if he's not that large in your deck. When he enters the battlefield, taps a creature an opponent controls, and that creature doesn't untap during its controller's next untap step. So another one of those abilities that's very good on the offensive or the defensive. Huge fan of the Treefolk. The Chiller Pillars, I was not that excited about when I first saw them. I kind of just throw them in here because they're snow creatures and I wanted more snow stuff. 4 mana 3/3 Insect with Monstrosity for 4 and 2 snow mana to become a 5/5 flyer. So yeah, I wasn't super excited about them in the first place, but then I realized even if you're spending 4 mana and then 6 mana later, a 5/5 flyer is legitimately monstrous. That is just a huge threat. And these Chiller Pillars actually ended some games, so ended up being a pretty big fan of the little butterfly in the background there on the Chiller Pillars. Once they get flying, those are some very good cards. We have a Reign of Revelation. I could not believe this card when I saw it. I didn't look at the whole set list for Modern Horizons, and I was just sitting there in the draft, and then I got this, 8th pick, and I was like, wait, they made Sift an instant? Oh my god, this card is absurd. Super happy to pick it up. Would have probably even liked even more of them. I don't know how well they would have worked in this deck, but it is really nice to have another way to discard Genesis. And it's also just great, man. Instant speed, draw 3, discard a card. Just fantastic. Alright, here we go. Here's the big boy himself. We have talked about him a lot. He is the biggest bomb in this deck, and I think he's almost impossible to beat in Limited if your opponent's not very fast. I feel like the only way you beat this card is if you outrace it hardcore, or just sideboard in some kind of graveyard removal. But yeah, Genesis, 5 mana for a 4/4 at the beginning of your upkeep. If it is in your graveyard, you can spend 3 mana. If you do, return a creature card from your graveyard to your hand. So absolutely fantastic. Super, super high on the card value spectrum. You're just drawing an extra card a turn, and it's always whatever the gassiest creature you have is. Just a fantastic card. It's obviously awesome with cycling stuff like Crows and Tusker. And the funniest thing, I got to live the dream one game. I legitimately got Genesis Spore Frog active against an opponent one game. And that was the whole reason Spore Frog was in here, was so that the dream could happen. And it did happen. So obviously the dream is you play Spore Frog with a Genesis in your graveyard. Once it goes to their turn and they do any kind of combat, sack your Spore Frog. They deal no combat damage that turn. Once it gets to your turn, spend your 3 mana, return Spore Frog to your hand, and recast it. So for 4 mana a turn, you can make it so your opponent cannot deal any combat damage during your turn, but you still get to deal combat damage during your own turn. So if you have flyers and they don't, no matter how small the flyers are, that is just an inevitable way to win. If your opponent has less cards in their library than you, that's an inevitable way to win. The only way that would be a problem is if the board is so clogged up you have absolutely no way to get through. Then you would still lose by milling eventually after a very long time. But luckily, I was playing against an opponent with very few flyers, and I managed to get a Chiller Pillar active after several turns of looping a Spore Frog. So it was fantastic and hilarious. That was probably the funnest thing that I did all day. My opponent probably didn't feel that way. But another really fun thing I could do with Genesis is my next bomb, which is a Deep Forest Hermit. 5 mana for a 1/1 with Vanishing 3, so it dies 3 turns after it enters the battlefield. And when it enters the battlefield, you get 4 1/1 green squirrels, and squirrels you control get +1/+1. Fantastic card. You play it out, it's a whole bunch of power immediately. Most of its time, this came out on turn 5 and just stopped my opponent dead in their tracks from attacking me. Usually I'd be getting beaten down pretty hard, maybe be down to 10 or even less at that point, and then I managed to get this Hermit out, and I'm like, alright, hold on, we're going to wait a bit. I'm going to sit here behind these squirrels while I start amassing my own large creatures. And so yeah, it was a very fantastic card on that front. I never got to loop it with Genesis, which is theoretically a thing you can do, but that would have been hilarious as well. And for the final 3 cards, we got a Webweaver Changeling, 3/5 reach. When it enters the battlefield, if there are 3 or more creatures in your grave, you gain 5 life. Fantastic card, very good blocker. Very good at getting you back into the game, which is something I needed a lot just because I was getting beaten in that early game, like I've said before. And a couple Excavating Aneroid. Very interesting card. I liked it a lot. It was definitely one of my biggest threats. Just being able to be a 5/5 Vigilance if you have Threshold manages to let you keep attacking your opponent even when you need blockers to survive. So very nice card. Also good card advantage. You sack a land to draw a card when you play it, and if it's turn 5, you probably don't need the land anymore at that point. So quite the good card. We then have all the stuff that I drafted that I didn't play. Most of that was just because I wanted to have a decent